Hello and welcome to this episode of the Academic Papers Podcast, where we celebrate academics and bring education to everyone. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something that might surprise you: the power of metaphors in research.
Yeah, metaphors, we often think of them as just figures of speech, right? But researchers are discovering they're much more than that.
It's like suddenly realizing that the way we frame a problem, the metaphors we use can actually shape the solutions we come up with.
That's exactly right. And this paper, Metaphor Research as a Research Strategy in Social Sciences and Humanities, it was published in the journal Quality and Quantity, and it really digs into this idea.
The authors are Sepehr and Parvaneh Aghaei. And they argue that using the right metaphor can be like finding the perfect key to unlock a whole new way of thinking about a problem, especially in the social sciences and humanities.
Yeah, and they highlight how metaphors are already being used to great effect in various fields. Like, for example, the ecosystem metaphor. It's been incredibly useful in understanding business and innovation.
And in gender studies, we have the glass ceiling metaphor, which has so powerfully highlighted the invisible barriers women face.
Yeah, even seemingly whimsical metaphors like comparing human resource management in Africa to Alice in Wonderland. It can offer valuable insights.
It's fascinating how a well-chosen metaphor can really simplify complex issues
Yeah,
and make research more engaging.
absolutely. And the authors argue that despite the growing use and potential of metaphors, there's still no clear process for using them effectively in research.
They even use a powerful analogy to illustrate how metaphors can dramatically shape our thinking. Comparing raising children to needing crutches versus raising them like kittens, it completely changes our approach.
It's a great example of how the metaphors we choose go far beyond just words. They frame our entire perspective.
So how do researchers actually go about using metaphors as a research tool?
Well, the authors propose adapting a four-step creative thinking process for metaphor research, starting with preparation.
Preparation, that sounds intriguing. What does that involve?
It's all about setting the stage. Researchers need to clearly identify the research problem and articulate why existing approaches might be falling short. This is where they make the case for why a fresh perspective, a new metaphor, is needed.
So it's about recognizing the limitations of current thinking and being open to new ways of framing the issue.
Precisely. And once that groundwork is laid, researchers move into the incubation stage.
Incubation, that sounds almost like hatching an idea.
It's a very apt metaphor. This stage is all about brainstorming and exploring various source domains, the concepts that will provide the basis for the new metaphor.
So if I'm researching, say, organizational change, I might brainstorm metaphors from nature like weather patterns or ecosystems.
Absolutely, exactly. You'd explore different source domains looking for one that resonates with the specific aspects of organizational change you want to study.
This is where the creativity really comes into play, isn't it? Finding that spark of inspiration.
Absolutely. And once you've identified a promising source domain, you move into the insight stage where you start building out the metaphor in detail.
So this is where you really flesh out the connections between the source domain, like weather patterns, and the target domain, organizational change, right?
Precisely. You start mapping out the specific connections, drawing parallels between concepts like wind speed and the pace of change within an organization, or pressure systems and the forces driving change.
It's like creating a detailed map, highlighting the hidden pathways between two seemingly separate worlds.
Exactly. And this detailed mapping leads to the final stage verification, where researchers test the metaphor's fit.
That makes sense. You want to make sure the metaphor isn't just a clever analogy, but actually hold up under scrutiny.
Absolutely. The authors propose a fitting test based on 7 principles to ensure the metaphor is robust and genuinely useful for research.
7 principles. Sounds pretty comprehensive. Can you give us a taste of what those principles entail?
Well, one principle is integration, which ensures that the source and target domains are coherently connected, creating a unified metaphorical image. Another is topology, meaning the relationships between elements in the source domain should accurately reflect the relationships in the target domain.
So it's not just about superficial similarities,
Yeah,
but making sure the underlying structure of the metaphor is sound.
exactly. But before we get lost in all 7 principles, I think it would be helpful to first explore the different types of metaphors researchers need to be aware of.
That sounds like a great place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, you're right. It's important to understand the different ways metaphors can work, before diving too deep into the selection process.
So let's unpack these different types of metaphors. The paper mentions orientational metaphors. What are those all about?
Orientational metaphors are all about spatial relationships. They give abstract concepts a physical direction.
Like happy is up and sad is down.
Exactly. We often talk about, feeling uplifted when we're happy or down in the dumps when we're sad. These metaphors give us a sense of orientation for these emotions.
It's interesting how these spatial metaphors are so ingrained in our language. We don't even think about them consciously most of the time.
Right. They're deeply embedded in how we think and talk about the world. Another type of metaphor is the ontological metaphor, which treats abstract concepts as concrete entities.
So something like inflation is eating away at our savings.
Precisely. By treating inflation as a physical entity, right, we can understand its impact more concretely. Then there are structural metaphors. These are particularly interesting for research because they shape how we understand the very structure of a concept.
The paper gave the example of mind as a container versus mind as a machine. How do these metaphors influence research?
Well, thinking of the mind as a container leads to questions about what's inside, what's being stored, and how much it can hold. Whereas thinking of the mind as a machine, focuses on processes, functions, and how the different parts work together.
So the metaphor we choose shapes the entire research agenda.
Exactly. And this highlights why choosing the right metaphor is so crucial. It's not just about finding a clever analogy. It's about finding a framework that guides our thinking and helps us ask the right questions.
Okay, so we've got these different types of metaphors: orientational, ontological, and structural. Now back to those 7 principles for the fitting test. Can we delve into a few more of those now that we have a better grasp of the types of metaphors out there?
Of course. Along with integration and topology, one principle I find particularly fascinating is predictivity.
Predictivity. So a good metaphor should be able to predict new things.
Exactly. It's not just about explaining what we already know, but about pointing us toward new avenues of inquiry, new relationships or elements within the target domain that we might not have considered before. A powerful metaphor can help us make predictions about how things might behave or interact.
That's really interesting. So it's not just about illumination, but also about generating new hypotheses and pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
Precisely. And another principle worth highlighting is concreteness. This principle emphasizes that the source domain, the concept we're using for the metaphor, should be more concrete and tangible than the target domain.
That makes sense. If the source domain is too abstract, the metaphor might be difficult to grasp or apply.
Right. Think about the argument is war metaphor. The concept of war with its physical battles and strategies is much more concrete than the abstract concept of argumentation. This concreteness makes the metaphor easier to understand and apply.
So the more tangible the source domain, the more easily we can connect it to the often more abstract target domain we're trying to understand.
Exactly. And this can be especially helpful in fields like social sciences or humanities where the concepts we're dealing with can be quite complex and nuanced.
It's like using a physical model to explain a theoretical concept. It gives us something tangible to hold on to.
A perfect analogy. And I think this brings us to a key takeaway about the power of metaphors in research. They can help us bridge the gap between the abstract and the concrete, making complex ideas more accessible and understandable.
That's a great point. We often think about metaphors as being poetic or literary, but they also have a very practical function in research, helping us to make sense of the world around us.
And speaking of the practical, I think it would be helpful to look at some real-world examples of how researchers are actually using metaphors in their work.
Absolutely. Let's move beyond the theoretical and see how these principles come to life in actual research studies. Welcome back to the show. We've been unpacking how metaphors aren't just for poets. They're powerful tools for researchers across all sorts of fields.
Yeah, and one area where this is really evident is in the field of management science.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily think of metaphors as being central to business research.
Well, the authors of our paper today actually use an example from their own research in management science. They were looking at relationships between firms and found that traditional models weren't really capturing the complexity of these interactions.
So they needed a new way of looking at the problem.
Exactly. And they found it in a rather unexpected place, the world of chemistry.
Chemistry. That's fascinating. How did they connect those two seemingly disparate fields.
Well, they use the metaphor of interactions between particles to understand relationships between firms.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through that.
Sure, so they drew parallels between different types of chemical bonds and different types of firm collaborations. For example, they mapped covalent bonds, which are strong and involve the sharing of electrons, to strategic alliances between firms.
So firms in a strategic alliance are like atoms sharing electrons,
Yeah,
deeply connected and working towards a common goal.
precisely. And they mapped weaker bonds, like ionic bonds, to more transactional relationships between firms.
That's a really clever way of visualizing different types of business relationships. Did this metaphor actually lead to any new insights?
Oh, it absolutely did. By applying the principles of chemistry to business interactions, the researchers were able to develop new models of firm collaboration, understanding the factors that contribute to strong, lasting partnerships.
So they use chemistry to unlock new knowledge about business. That's amazing.
Yeah, it highlights how a well-chosen metaphor can bridge the gap between seemingly unrelated fields, leading to unexpected and valuable insights.
This example really brings to life the power of metaphors in research. It's not just about finding a nice analogy. It's about using metaphors as a tool for discovery, for generating new hypotheses, and for pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
And it underscores the importance of being open to new perspectives, to looking beyond our own fields for inspiration. Who would have thought that chemistry could hold the key to understanding business relationships?
Right. It's a great reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, from making those connections that others might miss.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
Well, first, I hope they'll appreciate the power of metaphors not just as literary devices, but as valuable tools for research and critical thinking.
It's about recognizing that the way we frame a problem, the metaphors we use, can profoundly shape our understanding and the solutions we come up with. Exactly. Second, I hope they'll be inspired to explore the metaphors that shape their own thinking, in their own fields or areas of interest.
Are there any areas where a new metaphor could lead to groundbreaking insights? Are there any metaphors you're relying on that might be limiting your perspective?
Those are great questions for our listeners to ponder. And finally, I hope they'll be encouraged to approach metaphor research systematically using the four-step process and fitting test we discussed.
It's about combining creative thinking with rigorous analysis to ensure that the metaphors we choose are both insightful and valid.
Well said. And for listeners who want to delve deeper into this topic, I encourage you to go to academicjobs.com and search for Sepehr Ghazinoory and Parvaneh Aghaei to learn more about their work.
It's been a fascinating exploration of the hidden power of metaphors. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. Until next time, keep those metaphorical wheels turning.